We are in Joshua chapter 6, as you may have already heard in our reading. So since we're going to cover two chapters this morning, I thought I might give a quick sort of summary of our passage as a whole. So, as chapter 6 opens, the city of Jericho is secured tightly, but God announces that it has been given over into Israel's hand. And so, God gives special instructions for how the Israelites are to take the city. And so, with a combination of marching and trumpet blowing, the Israelites circle the city for 7 days. When on the last day, the final trumpet blows and the people shout and the walls fall down. Everything and everyone in the city were destroyed, except for Rahab and her household, who were saved because she had hid the spies that Joshua sent to Jericho. This total victory is followed with the first word of chapter 1, which is but. A man named Achan had taken for himself some of the treasure that was supposed to be devoted entirely to God. Joshua, not realizing that the Lord is angry, moves on with the mission, developing a battle plan against the next town over. But God allows Joshua's men to be defeated, even allowing 36 men to die. Joshua and the elders cry out to God, and God tells them why they were defeated. The people of Israel then carry with them the sin of this one man, Achan. God then identifies the man for them who had taken what belonged to God. And Joshua and the people of Israel devoted Achan and his family to destruction. The Israelites marked that place with stones and remember that place as the Valley of Trouble. Pretty good summary? Did I miss anything major?
No.
Okay. Before we got started in the book of Joshua, I told you that Joshua is one of 4 books known as the former prophets in Jewish tradition. The reason that I want you to keep that in mind this morning is because these two chapters, chapter 6 and chapter 7, are a strange bit of history for people to tell about themselves. Right? When we think about the way people naturally tell their histories, whether it's their personal history, their family history, or their national history, people tend to become the heroes of their own stories. I become the heroes of my own stories, right? Pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, overcoming all odds, rising above, digging deep, whichever way your metaphor goes, and defeating whatever obstacles stand before you, right? Individuals tell their personal stories like this. Families tell their family stories like this, and so do entire nations. Right now, you could pick up from the store any memoir written by any of the candidates running for president, and you will read these sorts of histories, narrating a rise from nothing to something, while highlighting all of their moral and political victories along the way. Right? Read the great histories of the histories of any great empire, as long as that history was written by that empire, and you will find the same thing. Chronicles of the empire's victories, epic tales of heroism, exalting the great leaders and the mighty warriors that built that empire. You get stories of great social and economic success, and you get myths that explain the empire's divine favor, the gods smiling down on all the empire has done. This morning, we come face to face with the strangeness of Joshua as history. Strange because the Israelites do little more than dance like show monkeys to achieve a great military victory. Strange because God's battle plans are insane. Right? Strange because the climax of the very first Israelite conquest story is a Canaanite salvation story. Joshua is strange because the story doesn't end in celebration, but with an Israelite who has broken faith with God. Strange because this story of victory is followed immediately by an embarrassing defeat. Strange because that defeat is led by Joshua, the same man who was just described in glowing terms. The book of Joshua is strange because the story ends with an Israelite and his entire family suffering the same destruction that a Canaanite prostitute and her family just escaped. This is not the kind of story that people choose to tell about themselves, their families, and their nations. Which is why the book of Joshua is no mere history. Joshua is the first of the former prophets, which means that Joshua is prophetic history. Joshua is an examination of Israel's past, authorized by God. This is the kind of history God chooses to have Israel tell and retell about themselves. Or the most obvious clues that the book of Joshua is written sometime later, looking back, is the closing notes related to Rahab and Achan. So in chapter 6, Rahab and her family are just saved. And in verse 25, we read that she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers from Joshua, whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. And then in chapter 7, we read the destruction of Achan and his family. And then in the final verse, verse 26, we read this. They raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. So in this way then, the book of Joshua is clearly looking back at the past. But it isn't interested in just simply relaying to us what happened. The details are far too selective in that. We read this and we go, oh, there's so many things I'd like to know. It also seems highly unlikely that a group of Israelites were sitting around together trying to piece together stories about their entry into the land and thought to themselves, ooh, this will be a really good way to tell our story. Instead, Israel has traditionally claimed that Joshua is prophetic history, which is an audacious claim because this claim about the book and these stories being prophetic history is to essentially believe that God worked through people called prophets to look back at Israel's past and to tell their story in such a way that its true meaning is able to shine through for all future generations, which is so important for us because God has given us a prophetic word in Joshua. This book is a gift of grace for us. As hard as it might be to hear at times, it is a gift of grace for us, a word from the God of Israel. And this word means something. And this word has ongoing significance for us as we seek God today. Yet, possessing God's prophetic word and even having God with you does not guarantee that you will then do what is good and what is right. Chapters 6 and 7 actually pivot on this reality. Chapter 6 ends in verse 27, and we read, "So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land." Immediately after that, in chapter 7, verse 2, Joshua is putting into motion plans of his own. He once again sends spies to a city. This is becoming really familiar. And rather than seeking God and God's plan, he seeks the word of the spies and he develops his own plan of attack on the city of Ai. 36 Israelites die as a result of Joshua's inattention to God's presence and God's word, both of which we already know that he had. Right? Joshua has the Lord with him. We just read that. So the Lord was with Joshua. And Joshua has been given God's prophetic word through Moses. We know from chapter 1 that he has this word and he's been meditating on it. But Joshua has not considered the meaning of the events that have just unfolded. He has not considered what their victory in Jericho might actually mean. And so once again, Joshua looks at the past and he learns the wrong lesson. And this is a danger to us. This will always be a danger to us, especially as we read a book like Joshua. It would be so easy for us to read Joshua and to learn the wrong lessons. I mean, there have been Christian writers and preachers through the centuries who have read Joshua in some pretty bizarre ways. And it would be easy, though, for us to just disregard those who preach and teach and lead from these strange readings of the story. But the problem with that is that these writers and these preachers have often been the Joshuas among us. Right? These have often been the spirit-filled brothers and sisters who are eager to study God's word and lead God's people by it. These are the Joshuas who have witnessed the Lord doing incredible things in their lives and in the church. These are Joshuas who have sat under the teaching and leading of incredible men and women of faith. These are Joshuas who would have benefited from some peers who had permission to speak honestly with them. Right? Imagine how different chapter 7 would have gone if Joshua had tried to send the spies to check out Ai, only to have the spies say, well, Joshua, what has the Lord said to you about this? Now Joshua would have been free to speak about the things that God has said previously. Well, God told us that he has given all of this land into our hands, so let's go get it. But what if Joshua sought the Lord before sending the spies? See, he sure feels motivated to pray after he's embarrassed at Ai and loses 36 men. I mean, this is all clearly hypothetical, but it's hypothetical in a way that seems to matter in light of the details. Chapter 7 opens by telling us that God has anger toward his people. But if there's anything we know about God, we spent a full year in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If there's anything we know about God from those books, it is the confession that makes its way throughout those books that God is merciful and gracious. That God is slow to anger and he is actively forgiving sin and iniquity. Not only that, God is with Joshua in the same way that he was with Moses. Which means that certainly Joshua would be free to go to God on behalf of the people the same way that Moses did, which Joshua seems to understand because this is exactly what he does after the defeat at Ai. But Moses sought God first. He called on God to turn from his anger, to turn from his plans against the people. And it's interesting because word for word, Moses and Joshua pray almost identical prayers. But they aren't identical because Moses knows that God is angry. Joshua doesn't. Although God is with Joshua. Is Joshua with God? Certainly, he is not present to God, knowing what God is feeling in this particular moment. And I imagine that this is an experience that is more common to our lives than we might be willing to admit. God's promise is good, which means that God is with us. Whether we feel that God is here or not, we can trust that it is so because he has said it. But how much of our lives could be described as being with God, but not being present to God? Perhaps in the same way that you're able to sometimes spend time with your family and others that you love, where you may be physically there, but your mind, your attention are clearly somewhere else. It's like the scene in the movie, the Pixar movie, In and Out, where the family's at the dinner table and the dad is lost in his own thoughts about a hockey game, and he has no idea what his wife and daughter are doing or talking about right in front of him at the table. God is with Joshua, but Joshua has no idea that God is angry. As readers of this story, sometime after these events have taken place, we read it and we know that God is angry because it says so for us. But only because God has given us this bit of revelation as we read it after the fact. The instruction that Joshua had available to him suggests strongly that had Joshua wanted to know how God was feeling about what had happened at Jericho, he could have sought him and found out. All Joshua needed to do was seek God. This is how Moses knew what God was feeling and thinking. The God who was angry with his people was there with Joshua. This is an incredible word of grace, that in God's anger, he doesn't immediately run or abandon or flee or create distance from his people, but he remains in order to be sought. But Joshua was blinded. Joshua was blinded for probably a number of reasons, but he was blinded by success for sure, and he was blinded probably by fame. We have a tendency to look at the outcome of an event and decide superficially, thumbs up, thumbs down. It worked, it didn't work. Success, failure. And here's the deal. We read chapter 6 and we go, Jericho was a complete and utter success. From all appearances, the Israelites had done everything they were asked to do, which then means two things. One, appearances aren't always what they seem. And two, just because God lets you work with him doesn't mean that you actually did anything worth having confidence in. Let me say those again. Just because God lets you work with him, it doesn't mean you actually did anything worth having confidence in. And appearances aren't always what they seem. Let me say something about appearances. These stories do something kind of wonderful for us that tends to drive us as modern readers insane. These stories offer us more than one perspective. Modern readers tend to read these passages and experience these as contradictions, but they are far more complex than that. So turn to chapter 6, verse 21. Chapter 6, verse 21, you read, "Then they devoted all of the city to destruction." Black and white, clear. Jump to verse 24. "And they burned the city and everything in it." Pretty clear, right? No. Because the truth in this story is that the Israelites did not devote all of the city to destruction. And they did not burn everything in it. We know this because in chapter 7, verse 11, we hear the truth spoken by God. Verse 11, "Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings." This is such an important part of reading Joshua and the former prophets. You cannot read everything at face value. An essential interpretive question becomes, whose perspective is being narrated? Because from the Israelite point of view, they have done exactly what they were supposed to. And these verses in chapter 6 are completely true. As they look at what they've accomplished, they go, we did it. But God does not always see things the same way that we do. And this is one of those sort of observations, right? But the reality that this story describes runs rampant through the church's history. People look at outcomes and they think, this looks good to me. It worked. We won. Mission accomplished. God is glorified. And without making an effort to seek God on the matter, the church keeps going, imagining that we've done good by God when all we've done is grieve the Spirit. And so this passage invites us into an awkward place. Are we willing to live in the tension that God's word invites us into? That things may not be as they seem. That what may have appeared to have been a vibrant and victorious season for the church in America was actually deeply corrupted from within by sin in the church. Is it possible that even though by all appearances we seem to be doing all right, that the church has been busy grieving God's Spirit? I want to suggest that the church in America keeps pushing forward, moving on to the next battle, from Jericho to Ai, because we look at the past and we see victory and we see faithfulness on behalf of the church. And so we have not yet let God refine us by showing us our sin and by showing us our unfaithfulness. I don't think the church has been honest. The church in America has been honest about our love and our deep worship of money. We certainly have not been honest about our deeply distorted ideas and desires related to our sexuality. We have not been honest about the subtle forms of racism and various forms of prejudice that have been given free rein in the church. And we have not seen our deep and abiding trust in violence as a sin of idolatry. The second point I wanted to make about appearances has to do with our part in God's successes. Earlier I said that just because God lets you work with him doesn't mean that you actually did anything worth having confidence in. This might seem like a strange statement, but I want to expand on that a bit. Joshua's fame was in all the land. This is how chapter 6 ends. But that's awkward, right? I mean, honestly, what did Joshua do? Except almost get 2 spies killed in chapter 1 or chapter 2. I mean, the story of Jericho and the walls coming down is told in a very particular way, a way that should do nothing for Joshua except lead Joshua to say, man, that was easy. I can't wait to see what bizarre instructions God gives us for the next city. But that's not what appearances said. From what people could see, Joshua is the one who gives the instructions. The people see Joshua's instructions followed, and they see the ark, and they see the priests passing and going around the city, and they hear the trumpets, and they hear the shout, and then they see the victory, and fame is given to Joshua. Even though the story makes it abundantly clear that God could have told the Israelites to dance around the city like circus monkeys, and it still would have fallen. Why? Because God was the one who was making it fall. God could have told them to do anything. The victory, the falling of the walls had nothing to do with the marching and the trumpets and the shouting. It had everything to do with God being the one who makes walls fall. And yet, Joshua allows his ability to follow directions go to his head. I mean, the Israelites win a decisive battle, and Joshua, in response to that, doesn't draw near to God. He doesn't draw near to God in victory. He doesn't come near with a thanksgiving offering. He doesn't come near with a word of thanks. Joshua has grown confident. He is certainly bold and he is courageous, but he has become bold and courageous about his own abilities. And chapter 7 tells then what happens when we buy into the appearance that we had far more to do with God's victory than we actually did. We assume that victory at Jericho depended on the trumpet blowing and the marching. We assume that God couldn't have made the walls fall without human help. Silly us. There's something else about this passage that's even more fundamental than Joshua and his shortcomings. And that is, of course, God. But it's not enough to just say, yeah, this passage is about God, right? All of Scripture is about God. This passage wants us to understand something very specific about God. Chapter 6 opens in a fascinating way. Verse 1 says, "Now Jericho was shut up tightly because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in." Shut up tightly. None went out, none came in. It would be easy enough to imagine that this is just some sort of colorful detail to show us how impregnable the wall around Jericho was. You cannot get through this wall. But at the heart of chapter 6 and chapter 7, both of these chapters seem to be telling stories about boundaries. Chapter 6, verse 23 says, "So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and they put them outside the camp of Israel." Rahab has been rescued, but she exists outside the impregnable wall that is the boundaries of the camp of Israel. The boundaries of Israel as a people are strict, and the Israelites exclude her. She is not one of them. She does not belong in their camp. They don't destroy her because they promise not to, but they also do not make space for her. One of the questions that we're left with is, can the God who makes walls fall down also tear down the barriers that divide people? Verse 25 says something interesting. Just 2 verses later. "But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved, and she has lived in Israel to this day." Think about what this says. From the vantage point of someone else looking back in time, these Canaanite foreigners were saved by God, but they were kept out of Israel's camp. God has brought Israel around these Canaanites so that they have now and for some period of time found a home among or in the midst of the Israelites. God has created a hospitable space for foreigners to dwell among his people and to seek him. There is no Israel and Canaanite. There is only the people of God. And this is finally demonstrated when the native ethnic Israelite, Achan, is treated as though he were a Canaanite. Rahab acts as the faithful are supposed to, and she finds a home among God's people. Achan acts as a faithless, rebellious Canaanite, pridefully rising up against God and taking what belongs to God as though it belongs to him. And God demonstrates that Achan is not as secure within Israel's boundaries as he may have imagined. Achan may have imagined that he was secure within the impregnable walls of God's people. But the God who makes the walls of Jericho fall apparently is also able to exclude one who refuses to give his life to the God who is Lord of them all. The God who can make the walls of Jericho fall can also destroy whatever dividing wall of hostility humans have constructed to divide themselves. Paul's letter to the Ephesians describes this work of Jesus and the cross. But the God who can make the walls of Jericho fall can also tell his church to remove one from among them, delivering them over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians trains us in that work. The wall that God has destroyed, that makes all of this possible, is the wall that we have created. The wall that we have created to separate us from God. God seeking to reconcile himself to us, sinners and rebels. God gave his own Son to us and for us. This is what we remember, and this is what we memorialize every single week as we receive the bread and the cup. What kind of God do we serve? We serve a God who tears down walls, who tears down the walls that we build between him and us, who tears down the walls that would divide us from the people that he would gather together and call his own. And so the beautiful thing about this meal is that every time the church participates in it, everyone is welcome. The invitation is open, that all who would seek God as Rahab did, seeking him to trust him with their lives, are free to come and eat at the table of God, the banquet of God, which has been opened to all people who would come and seek him and know him and be in relationship with him. I'm going to invite our servers to come. And as they get in their places, I'll give them the bread and the cup, and we'll sing together. And I will invite you to come and receive the bread and the cup and return to your seats, where we'll all take them together as one people. If you would come down the center aisle and return down the sides, that makes the best logical flow for this. Would you come and receive the gifts of God, the people of God?